Hello, and welcome to the second webinar that the Jackson Center has put on this year. My name is Kristen McMahon. I serve as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center, located in beautiful Jamestown, New York. We are excited today to present this webinar, Fuel on the Fire, the Shadowy World, Aiding and Abetting War Crimes in the Middle East. And this panel that you will be learning from and interacting with today is really amazing. I'd like to first introduce our moderator. Beth Van Schaack is the Leah Kaplan Visiting Professor in Human Rights at Stanford Law School, where she teaches in the areas of international human rights, international criminal law, and human trafficking, among other subjects. And she has been the acting director of the Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic. She is also a faculty fellow with Stanford Center for Human Rights and International Justice at Stanford University. Prior to returning to academia, she served as deputy to the ambassador at large for war crimes issues in the Office of Global Criminal Justice of the U.S. Department of State under Secretaries Clinton and Carey. And in that capacity, she helped to advise the Secretary of State and the Undersecretary on the formulation of U.S. policy regarding the prevention of and accountability for mass atrocities such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Beth, thank you so much for being with us today.
Great, and thank you so much, and thanks so much for the Robert Jackson Center for hosting this really important conversation today.
And I do want to mention to our audience that at any point today, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. You don't have to wait until the end of this, and we will address the questions as we go. And with that, Beth, I will turn it over to you.
Wonderful. So we are focusing today on the wars ravaging the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Yemen. But I think many of the ideas that we'll be discussing are going to be relevant to conflicts the world over. We're focusing not on the immediate parties either, so not necessarily on the states or the non-state actors that are embattled for power over the sovereign territory, but rather we're really interested in looking closely at the role of enablers. Those other countries, those corporations, those terrorist groups, organized crime that are fomenting, sustaining, profiting from, and ultimately prolonging the wars in the Middle East, all to the detriment of the civilian population and to adherence to international law. We know that there are legal doctrines around complicity, aiding and abetting, et cetera, that can be invoked here, that can ascribe responsibility and ultimately legal accountability to these outside entities. And so we've convened a really terrific panel to discuss these issues from a legal and a policy perspective. So I'll take a moment just to introduce our panelists. Their bios are incredibly rich, and so I'm really not doing them a full service here, but in the interest of getting to our fuller conversation, I'll just give you the highlights of their backgrounds. So first we have Radwan Ziadeh, who's a senior fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., and also a visiting research at the Democratic Transition Program at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha. He's also the founder and director of the Damascus Center for Human Rights Studies in Syria and the Syrian Center for Political and Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C. He's a fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding in Washington and a member of the panel of experts at the UN Commission of Inquiry, who has been looking at the protests in occupied Palestinian territory that was established by the Human Rights Council. He's managing editor of the Transitional Justice Project in the Arab world, head of the Syrian Commission for Transitional Justice, which was established in 2013 by the Syrian opposition interim government. And in this capacity, he's been working on the transitional justice file, including investigating crimes, means for prosecution, and ultimately building a national reconciliation program. Since the uprising in Syria in March 2011, he's been involved very closely in documenting ongoing human rights violations, and I know he'll speak to that today. Next, we have William Wiley. Dr. Wiley has 23 years experience as an international criminal investigator, an intelligence analyst, and a legal advisor. He's worked in a number of wars and post-conflict situations in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Europe. In 1997, he joined the War Crimes Section of the Department of Justice of Canada, and proceeding there, he went to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. He was also the first investigator retained by the International Criminal Court in 2003, and he served as an international law advisor for the trials of Saddam Hussein and other senior Ba'athist leaders in Baghdad in 2005 to 2008. In 2011, he founded the nonprofit foundation Commission for International Justice and Accountability, CIJA, and we'll hear a lot about CIJA's work today. CIJA undertakes criminal investigations in Syria vis-a-vis the Syrian regime, and also since 2014 has been looking at the so-called Islamic State, focusing on Daesh operations in Syria and Iraq. In this regard, CIJA works in cooperation with a range of national and international law enforcement bodies, including Interpol and Europol. CIJA has now expanded its work in and around Myanmar and is establishing itself on the ground in Libya and also West Africa. Next, we have Zaid Rad Al-Hustan, who's the professor of practice of law and human rights at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a former Jordanian diplomat who also served as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2014 to 2018. He played a central role in the establishment of the International Criminal Court and was elected as the first president of the Assemblies of States Parties of the ICC. He also served as a political affairs operation in the former Yugoslavia in UNPROFOR, which was the UN mission there. He's been a career diplomat, serving as Jordan's permanent representative to the United Nations from 2000 until 2007, and he also has been ambassador from Jordan to the United States. He's also been invited, and I hope I'm not insulting him by telling everyone this, but to join the Elders. It's an independent group of really highly respected global leaders working for peace, justice, and human rights. And this was founded by the late and wonderful Nelson Mandela. And finally, this panel is really the brainchild of Dr. David Crane, who was the founding chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. In that capacity, he investigated, indicted, and ultimately helped convict President Charles Taylor of Liberia for international crimes committed in neighboring Sierra Leone. And this was no easy feat because there was no indication that President Taylor had actually stepped foot in Sierra Leone, but he was nonetheless able to sustain and foment that conflict from neighboring Liberia. He's been investigating international crimes committed in Syria and Yemen for over a decade as part of the Global Accountability Network, which he also founded. He's also the co-author of what has now become one of the most important caches of evidence coming out of the Syrian conflict, and that's the Caesar report. And this report has analyzed a cache of images, digital images, horrific to see, that show that President Assad of Syria and his henchmen are committing horrific crimes and really torture on an industrial scale. This clearly rises to the level of crimes against humanity. And I can recommend to you his recent book. He's recently published his memoirs about his experience prosecuting international crimes around the world, and it's called Every Living Thing. So with those introductions, I'm really pleased to kick off our conversation here. David, why don't you get us started, since you, this panel is really your brainchild. You have been investigating international crimes in the Middle East for over 10 years. What have you found about the involvement of other entities, states, parties, international organizations, cartels, and corporations in the Middle East? And how are these sustaining these conflicts?
Well, good morning. Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are. And to my colleagues, thank you for joining us on this panel. Beth, thank you for agreeing to moderate. And again, a real shout out to that great Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. This is an important discussion, fuel on the fire, something that I have been faced with for almost 2 decades. The backgrounders, the corporations, the states, parties, the individuals who are involved in atrocity, but never see the light of day. This is the dark side of what I call dirty little wars, in some ways kaleidoscopic conflict, where parties are working with and against each other at the same time for whatever geopolitical reason they're doing that. And so this is an unspoken issue, but one that has really manifested itself in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, and of course, in Yemen in particular, where we recently had the United Nations clearly, almost a clarion bell call that we have nation states, members of the United Nations, to include members of the UN Security Council, directly involved, aiding and abetting actors who are committing atrocity. And so this is also, in some ways, as a founder of international criminal law, a cutting edge area where all of us in this panel and all of you, some of you listening in, are starting to think about culpability, both civil as well as criminal, in these kind of actions. In the past, we've had very little action taken against them. We see it a little bit in Nuremberg with the Krupps, But at the end of the day, corporations have kind of skated along with very little culpability, making tens of billions of dollars on the backs of victims of atrocities. So we see this particularly in the Middle East, and very shadowy. Nations have been trying, particularly in Syria and Yemen, to position themselves for some kind of influence in a future peace accord, or at least influencing the outcome of these kaleidoscopic, these dirty little wars. And Syria is an incredible case study. I've been particularly concerned, and recently there has been an action by Syrian victims in a London court who are taking on, of all things, Qatar, who have been backing a horrific party to the Syrian conflict, and that is the al-Nusra Front, to the tens of millions of dollars. It's almost but for the cutout of Qatar providing monies to the al-Nusra Front, they may not have been able to sustain their presence in Syria. And they've done this through cutout corporations and funneling funds through the Doha Bank. I only state this is because, again, we're starting to see questions being raised. And I think that's why talking with Beth and my colleagues here on the panel and the president of the Jackson Center, I think we need just to have an honest discussion about this issue, and that is fuel on the fire. But for some of these actions by states, parties, corporations, international terrorist organizations, and international organizations, these horrific conflicts sustaining or committing atrocity may not be as intense. And so that's why we're here, and I look forward to further discussions. Back to you, Beth.
Terrific. So Radwan, I wonder whether you might discuss this issue in the context of the Syrian conflict. We know that this began as peaceful protests that were met by violence by the Assad regime. The situation then sort of evolved into more of a full-scale internal armed conflict between the Assad regime and the Free Syrian Army. But then the conflict metastasized, and this was very much due to the intervention of a myriad of outside actors. Can you help to map this situation for us and discuss how the involvement of so many of these outside actors, as David described, has not only prolonged the terrible conflict, but also worsened the impact on the civilian population?
Thank you, Beth, and thank you for the Jackson Center. And I'm honored actually to be with this panel with those great scholars who shape the international law as we see it right now. As we know, after the World War II and the birth of the Security Council or the United Nations, number of the civil war or the wars between states has been decreased dramatically. And as a replacement of the war between states, there's something erupted, which now we call it civil wars, especially in Latin America in the 80s, in 90s, Africa, and now in the Middle East. But most of the studies who study the civil war or the history of the civil war, they call it's wrong to call it civil war because it's most likely it's a regional wars. There are actually states who's been surrounding other states are involved in civil wars. And if we look into the data provided to many political scientists, it shows that the involvement of the regional conflict in these civil wars, it most likely helped the prolonged civil war. And this is why I think that it's amazing case study of Syria, because what started as a peaceful demonstrations in March 2011, the response by the Assad government was a clear policy, shoot to kill, because he learned from other demonstrations in Egypt and in Tunisia and in Libya before that the use of violence, it's the only way to end the revolution early, and not the other way around, not to have a peaceful negotiations with the protesters and to find a settlement at the end. And that's led, of course, starting in August 2011, people to feel that until August 2011, more than 5,200 lost their life. in a peaceful protest. They lost faith in non-violence, or disobedient activities, and start actually looking into different models and different taking arms. That's where start the people also to refuse the orders in the Syrian National Army, and the Syrian National Army is the fourth national army in the region. It's one of the largest. It's equipped of more than 400,000, and this is where actually the collapse within the army started, and people, they joined and they formed something called a Free Syrian Army. What we know that the Free Syrian Army was just a brand. There is no effective structure for the Free Syrian Army to be able to fight against the Syrian National Army, and that's what ended as a guerrilla and different militias under the brand of the Free Syrian Army. And at the same time, with the collapse of the Syrian National Army, collapse into different militia groups within where Hezbollah decided to intervene. And believe in October 2011, we start to see the regional involvement, where the breakdown of the Syrian peaceful revolution and start the national or the regional power to intervene. We have from the Syrian regime side, we have Iran and Hezbollah as a militia step into to help Hezbollah, and then from the opposition side, we have Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates, and in other nations, of course, coalition and the United States. When the case has been transferred to the Security Council, and the first one was in August 2011, it was clear that the Security Council was unable to do any actions because between the United States from one side and Russia and China from the other side. Since August 2011 until today, Russia practiced 16 vetoes at the Security Council. It became like a national Syrian war as a national security issue for Putin and Russia. But that's, of course, leveled the Syrian conflict into a level international conflict. Not only it has a national layer or regional layer, it has an international layer. And then, of course, as we know, any civil war, when the state party involved in the war, as the number increased, the number of years will increase. And this is why until we have international settlement on the international level or on the regional level, things will be very difficult. But I will end here by emphasizing on the subject, fuel on the fire, because when we have in the Syrian conflict as a conflict too much internationalized and regionalized, it's very important to look into how different states has been helping and maybe complicit in committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, especially Hezbollah and Iran from one side and Russia from the other side. And we look to the case of the International Court of Justice, when it looked of the case of United States and Nicaragua, when they looked into the threshold hold. The threshold hold that different state can be involved and can be indicted of direct involvement of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Great, thank you so much. Bill, I'm curious, from your seat with Zeid and your Syrian and other international investigators, what are you seeing from the perspective of your evidentiary collections in Syria and in Iraq as well, if you want to speak about that? What are you able to document from the perspective of the role of these outside actors and their deleterious influence on the conflicts? Oh, Bill, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. It's devilishly difficult, I'm afraid, Beth. As you rightly pointed out in the introduction, Zeid is a criminal investigative body. We're set up to support public sector law enforcement and prosecutorial authorities who can't readily, if at all, get into high-risk areas. So we assist them with their evidence collection and so forth. So we're in the business, so to speak, of establishing individual criminal liability with an eye to prosecutions. In this respect, our work differs substantially from the valuable efforts of human rights documenters and even, for that matter, of, say, domestic intelligence services. So CJA, which is quite well resourced, but resources are always finite, tends to focus on where targets or institutions where there's a reasonable likelihood ultimately of detaining individuals and prosecuting those individuals. And when it comes to outside actors where the war in Syria is concerned, those prospects are limited. And let me get into a bit of detail there on, if you'll permit me. It's a matter of public knowledge that our two targets in Syria are the regime since the beginning, since 2011, and Daesh, or Islamic State, since it emerged as a force to be reckoned with in early 2014. And each presents unique problems, but also some possibilities. In terms of targeting the regime per se, as opposed to foreign actors, Siege is very, very well positioned, as some will know. We hold now about 1 million pages of Syrian regime documentation that we've extracted from, to use the American term, the battle space. These materials are quite well organized. They're political, military, and security intelligence materials, so they enable us to reconstruct those structures of perpetration and the individuals responsible for the perpetration of all manner of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So in this respect, we're in good shape. When it comes to the foreign actors, however, there's limitations, certainly where Siege is concerned, and I would suggest where any criminal investigative body, where it's public or private, is concerned. So with respect to CJA, the activities of foreigners, foreign states, foreign entities, and here, of course, I refer principally to Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and Iranian Shia militia, which were quite heavily engaged around Damascus in particular until 2014. These entities, their leaders, they don't appear in our documentary collection. I don't want to suggest that they don't appear in Syrian documents. I would expect the nature of Syrian bureaucracy is such that they do in many respects. It's simply that Siege doesn't have those materials. So by way of example, Russian aerial operations undertaken, or indeed Hezbollah military operations on the ground, undertaken in support or alongside regime forces, undoubtedly those are in military documents, recorded in military documents as a matter of course. But again, we don't have it. So we don't, CJA, again, from a criminal investigative point of view, as opposed to a reporting or an intelligence point of view, is really not well placed in this regard. And then the other thing, and I don't want to be provocative here, but the mere presence of foreign forces in the war in Syria is not in and of itself a criminal offense. You can suggest that it's morally distasteful and so forth, and indeed that it fuels the fire of the conflict or prolongs the conflict. It undoubtedly prolongs the conflict. But again, if we look for criminal conduct, with the arguable exception of Russian aerial operations, where a lot of interesting and frankly, I think quite good work's been done, we don't see a lot of criminality with respect to Iranian forces and Hezbollah. Hezbollah in particular, and I hasten to add, I'm not a fan of Hezbollah, but it's a highly disciplined professional force, in particularly compared to the Syrian armed forces, and never mind the Syrian regime militia. So again, and not much work, certainly by CIJA, is being done. In fact, we don't do any work vis-a-vis those four parties: Russia, Hezbollah, Iranian militia, and the Iraqis. And it goes back to the point I made earlier: is what are the prospects of arrest and prosecution? And for the actors from those institutions or those forces, for a range of reasons, political and diplomatic principally, the prospects for prosecution, I would suggest, are effectively nil. However, it's not all doom and gloom when we look at the supporters of foreign supporters of the regime. Where there is good prospects for prosecutions, quality investigations to criminal standard and prosecutions, is where we look at foreign economic actors. For example, businessmen, those engaged, it would be more of a stretch in, let's say, maintaining the value, such as it is, of the Syrian pound, foreign credits to the regime that are used to purchase certain types of military hardware and so forth. There is some potential there. But again, I don't want to overstate it. And the reason is because the legal framework is not ideal. You would be looking at an aiding and abetting case, and the knowledge requirement in aiding and abetting, as it's currently set out in international criminal law, is such that it would be difficult to clear that hurdle in a prosecution. Now, there is exceptions. For example, if we took businessmen or firms, the individuals running firms who sold, and I again, just purely an example off the top of my head, chemical precursors or precursors to the Syrian state for the manufacture of chemical weapons. We have, as most of you will know, we have some precedent there from the Netherlands, the Van Anrat case. Van Anrat sold precursors to regime of Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, and Van Anrat was ultimately successfully prosecuted and imprisoned in the Netherlands for that. So this is, I think, from a criminal law perspective, where we need to focus. And then finally, again, briefly, when we turn to Daesh, again, the key here, because Daesh didn't enjoy any meaningful foreign institutional, support. Nobody at that level liked Daesh, or they may have liked it. It may have been useful, but anyways, it's not like the regime. Again, I think you want to focus on economic actors, in particular businessmen. We have in France the Lafarge case, the cement manufacturing company that continued to produce at a huge facility in northern Syria after the area was taken over by Daesh. I don't know fully the details of the case, but there is a number of officers from that company who have difficulties with the French National War Crimes Program at this point. And incidentally, that case came to light through some very fine work of a couple of rather small human rights NGOs who managed to secure some quite damning documentation from the company, emails and so forth. But where the real potential for hitting economic actors who engage with Daesh will come is when the vast majority of Daesh-generated documentation starts to be exploited. That material is still in Syria. It's in, from a Western perspective, friendly hands. It's in northeast Syria, held by the Syrian Kurds, and works underway by not by CIJA, but another body to start making that material usable and available to domestic law enforcement authorities. So I think, of course, that process is held up by the pandemic, but I think we'll see real potential there. And also in dealing with Daesh, I think getting around the aiding and abetting, the knowledge requirement of aiding and abetting will be somewhat easier from a prosecutorial point of view. Thank you.
Oh, terrific. Thank you. Zaid, maybe I'll turn to you next, since you've been involved in a number of conflicts around the world in your various incarnations through the United Nations, as the head of the ASP of the International Criminal Court and as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. What have you seen in terms of the negative influence of these outside actors, including economic actors, as Bill has focused on, in prolonging conflicts and making them more harmful to civilians? Do we have the law we need in the pantheon of international human rights and the human rights machinery to really address these situations?
Well, thank you, Beth. And I too am delighted to be back at the Jackson Center, sort of not physically, of course, but remotely. It's been 5 years, I think, since I've engaged in any discussion through the center. And thank you, David Crane, for setting this up. You know, while I was listening to Bill speak and to Radwan, it occurred to me that nothing has changed since the 30 Years' War. And of course, Bertolt Brecht's one of his most celebrated plays, Mother Courage, illustrates the point that in every conflict, you're going to have war profiteers. They could be either profiteers from, let's say, the private sector, or they could be profiteers allied to the government. And that's why governments generally don't collapse. They don't suffer from shortage of liquidity because the black markets are functioning very well. For everything works. The gun smuggling, arms trading, weapons, fuel, all of it's functioning. And we see this the world over, and it's nothing has changed there. I think Bill's right. The law, I remember in our discussions on elements back in the 1990s, we didn't go into aiding and abetting because already proving knowledge and intent was going to be hard enough, and finding the linkage evidence. So going one step further would make it even more complicated. The law, like scholarship, like academic scholarship, tries to simplify a world that is not simple. When looking at the Sahel, for instance, a few years ago, it was such a sinewy, messy sort of ball of, it's almost like a neural bundle where you have intelligence agencies, almost sometimes working with criminal networks, supported by reputable banks, laundering money through well-established capital cities. You know, it's just a mess. And we try and sort of carve out spaces, so at least of sanity, of sort of where we think, and all of it contributes to conflict and civilian harm, all of it. And including, of course, as Radwan said at the beginning, actions by the permanent members of the Security Council to block collective movement. I mean, we saw this time and again, and as he was saying in Syria, Yemen, of course. Look at Libya now. I mean, Libya gives you an impression of where Syria is going. We can't even get the report of the panel of experts published because Russia's blocking it. And there you have another proxy war with the most miserable conditions for the Libyan people and crimes being committed on a daily basis. So it is particularly tough. I worry also philosophically about moving into areas because we're desperate. We have revolving investigations. The group of experts do outstanding work. And I cautioned the Human Rights Council, don't just keep sending them out there to do every year another year of investigations. Move it forward. They should create a IIIM for Yemen, or create a permanent IIIM altogether, which is, I think, what I wanted and what I think hopefully the current High Commissioner would want. And so there are things that can be done. The problem is that governments, because they're somehow involved in much of this, are not the ones that are going to be the keen to create, to come up with creative thinking. And so it's always individuals who happen to act on behalf of governments, who think more independently, who will do that sort of thing. So I'm still, like Bill, hopeful that when the jurisdictional window is open, that we can see a normative development occurring. And then in time, he mentioned Lafarge and the French. I don't know where the French have reached in terms of their litigation of Lafarge, but those sorts of emblematic cases should serve warning. and more in the business and human rights side, we see growing pressure on business through the environmental and social governance sort of requirements, along with the fiduciary requirements, that we need to roll this in as well, you know, ending civilian harm. And that, I think, could also work if we tie in international criminal responsibility. I agree with David Crane. It's sad in one way that Nuremberg wasn't stronger. You know, one of the saddest things is that one of those who was litigated in this 12 subsequent trials became the wealthiest person in Europe after he was released from imprisonment after having been convicted of aiding and abetting, and became a celebrated figure in his country. Rather sad. It doesn't give you sort of the clarion call you need. So I think we need to think creatively and think how to find those spaces. But it is like a neural bundle, and it is extremely difficult to unpack it. And when you go in deep, you'll find, I mean, and this is something that Radwan would know, and Bill as well, and David, that in Syria, you got the impression for much of the time after 2011, that many of these groups had fluid memberships. They were basically murtazaka or mercenaries, and they would go to the highest bidder. Now, if you go, what I like about this initiative is you look at the paymaster, but the paymasters were plentiful. And then how do you hope to have jurisdictional coverage if the paymasters are so many in these areas? So it's hugely challenging. I think we just have to be dogged and slowly, you know, basically eat away at this problem. But it's certainly much more difficult than I think most people, you know, think it is. It really is. It's hugely difficult. That's just tracking the financial flows and through which banks and the intermediaries is hard enough, you know. And then to get the linkage evidence for aiding and abetting, as Bill was saying, I mean, very, very difficult on the mens rea, on the, as you said, the knowledge requirement, very difficult.
Just for the benefit of our listeners who may be not familiar with it, the IIIM is an independent investigative body that was formed by the General Assembly to focus on Syria. And it will be doing its own investigations, but also serving as a sort of repository to all the good work that's being done by civil society organizations and private investigative efforts like CIJA. And CIJA's got a cooperative arrangement with the IIIM. And the goal is to sort of hold and authenticate this evidence for when there is a court with potential jurisdiction over international crimes being committed in Syria. And so there has been this idea proposed, which Zaid has advocated for, of a permanent IIIM that would focus on conflicts around the world, because at the moment Yemen has no dedicated entity focused on it besides the group of experts from the Human Rights Council. And so that could really be a step forward in terms of making the Nuremberg legacy real. Turning to you, David, the previous panelists have discussed the real difficulty of allocating individual criminal responsibility here. And we've talked about the sort of how easy it can be to go after the direct perpetrators, assuming you can identify who those are. But the minute you get to the aiders and abettors and the enablers and the funders and, you know, these sort of layers and layers of other accomplices, it becomes more difficult. Could you give us a brief overview of what the current thinking is of the theory of aiding and abetting and how that might be applied within the context of these Middle East wars? Oh, you're on mute, David.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
Apologize for that. Thank you again, my colleagues, for your important perspectives, and I agree wholeheartedly with this. This is difficult work, but that's why we do it. It is difficult, and difficulty does not make us shy away from seeking justice for victims of atrocity. You know, just a pause here real quick. I think it's important for our listeners to understand that, you know, really we're kind of in a third wave of accountability, of finding justice for victims of atrocity. The first wave was at Nuremberg. The second wave was the heady days of the Age of Accountability between 1993 and 2015, 2016. And then all of a sudden we see something I never contemplated, something almost back in the 1920s and 1930s, essentially a rise of the strongman, of nationalism, of populism, and where you see the international community, led by some very key countries, have stepped away from some of the hard work that the individuals on this panel and are listening in have tried to seek justice. And so we're, in some ways, we're kind of in an age of a strongman. I think that's important because it affects directly the topic that we're talking about of fuel on the fire, outside actors in the murky shadows trying to profit, trying to gain an upper hand geopolitically, whatever it may be. But the world is not as excited about accountability as it was, dare I say, just 3 or 4 years ago. I never, frankly, and I'm sure my colleagues here would agree with me, I never thought I would be even talking about this. But yet we are, and I think it has hurt our ability. Now, does that mean we stop? No, of course. We continue our work through mechanisms, through grassroots efforts, through the important work of states parties to both the Rome Statute, but just the United Nations, of taking up the mantle and prosecuting individuals. And Europe has been a leading continent in this area. The European Union, we have Germany, Denmark, Sweden, even Spain, all working to try to seek justice, particularly out of Syria. So I think that that's kind of important just to kind of wrap up our initial discussion and then shift gears a little bit. You know, Bill's right, Zaid's right. Aiding and abetting appears to be a simple idea, and that's true under law, but the practicality of proving it, and then just the overlay of the political aspects of aiding and abetting and the actor that may or may not be involved, make it very, very complicated. It doesn't mean we shouldn't walk away from it. In fact, personally, having been in this for a long time now, I think we're moving in a correct direction. I think the cracks are starting to form in the veneer of corporate liability, non-liability, states parties lurking in the background, international organizations. I think the trend is actually going in our direction, and we just have to push, continue to push, look for that case that we can use to break cause new law and cause new jurisprudence in this area. But at the end of the day, we have a state party, we have a corporation that's doing business in the Middle East. They want to make some money, lots of money. They are someone who is manufacturing arms or precursors to chemical weapons or whatever the issue may be. And so they are working with nations who are directly involved in a conflict such as Yemen, for example, Saudi Arabia. Now, those countries who have long ties with Saudi Arabia, such as the United States, United Kingdom, and others, they're providing happily all the weapon systems that Saudi Arabia would like for long-term reasons, which we could get into maybe in question and answers. But they are directly providing weapon systems that the Saudi Arabians are using. And I use this on this side of this proxy war. We obviously know that Iran is very much involved on the other side, but they are providing weapon systems which the Saudis are using, and they're using them in violation of the Geneva Conventions. They are using weapon systems not for military and necessary reasons, but in reality, terrorizing populations. They are intentionally targeting civilians. In and of itself, a war crime per se. So again, does the United States know this? Do actors and corporations that do business in the United States or multinational corporations know this? Yes, they do. So the door is open for liability. Now, of course, being an old chief prosecutor, you have to prove each and every element of the crime. But if an actor knows and of another person who actually is perpetrating war crimes and continues to provide knowingly the methods and the ability to perpetrate those war crimes, we're well down the road towards aiding and abetting. And it's to the political embarrassment, but also the criminal liability of countries, of corporations, and other outside actors, international organizations that murk about this area, profiting or whatever, trying to influence outcomes. They are much more in a direction where they don't want to be. If I was a general counsel of a corporation, and I know that this is happening, I mean, I think corporations are beginning to step back a bit and say, wait a minute, there are human rights aspects to this. And we've had civil liabilities that have caused corporations to be aware of that. Criminal liability hasn't happened much. Just as an aside, kind of an interesting little case out of West Africa when I was chief prosecutor, we found the Oriental Timber Company, a Dutch company headed by Gus Koyhoven, very much involved in filtering weapon systems to Charles Taylor and his militias that were doing harm both in Liberia as well as in Sierra Leone, Guinea, what have you. And so we had he was not part of my mandate, but we provided a dossier to the Dutch government, which went and prosecuted him and charged him with not only weapons embargo, violations of the UN weapons embargo, but actually charged him with war crimes because he was directly involved in weapon systems that were Charles Taylor and his henchmen were using to commit war crimes in their country as well as in Sierra Leone and other countries. That litigation kept going, but that was also the beginning in the modern era in some ways, one of the first efforts where he was found guilty in and around those actions. So again, we just chip away, we keep moving forward in these areas, but and nations are beginning to consider the ramifications. Now, the political problem with this is it's the United States, it's the United Kingdom, it's Russia. We're talking about 3/5 of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. So this is where Zeid's and Bill's commentary come immediately into effect, and that is, okay, so you have that. What's next? Well, it basically carves out the United Nations, but we did something very smart for the mechanism in Syria, and that was we went around the Security Council and went to the General Assembly. So again, in this third wave of atrocity accountability, as I call it, we're still doing this. The United Nations is getting itself involved as much as we can, but I think also, and I've been working with my good friend and colleague Erwin Cutler out of Canada, we should start looking at regional organizations or regional pacts, groups of nations who are regionally outside of the UN paradigm concerned about issues related to their particular areas. And I think that's something we should be thinking about too in places like Venezuela. The horrific genocide going on as I speak in Western China for the Uyghur peoples, where the world is doing nothing. And yet we have China hosting an Olympics here very, very shortly, and yet we have a genocide going on in that very country. And so we're talking about a group of nations in the region creating a mechanism, despite the United Nations, to do something to hold China at least aware that the world isn't going to walk away. So again, that's just kind of for our listeners, kind of putting it all in some, hopefully some perspective.
Thanks so much for that. So Zaid, I think many people would assume that the International Criminal Court would be able to take up this question, not only of crimes committed by direct perpetrators, but also by their accomplices. Could you walk us through why the International Criminal Court has not been able to address the war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed in these wars in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, it's a straightforward jurisdictional issue. Either the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over a subject matter offense, or it is given that jurisdiction to exercise by the UN Security Council. And if neither of those obtain, then there has to be some creative thinking. We've seen, for instance, in the context of Myanmar and Bangladesh, that the International Criminal Court is interpreting the article relevant to deportation, forcible movement of peoples expansively, and so creating a jurisdictional sort of carve out for itself. But in general, of course, it's hampered by the fact that we have terrible leadership around the world across many, many governments, very unenlightened, poor leadership, and it's reflected in all the institutions that are international, because poor leaders will elect poor leaders of international institutions by and large. And so we're in a state of basic decomposition. If it were not for, stalwart lawyers, enterprising journalists, very brave human rights defenders, those who will not be cowed and those who will not bow, to this sort of state of affairs, I think we're completely lost. So the hope that we have is that there are those who will just defy the basic instinct, which is the instinct of self-preservation, and speak out and send documents and take risks. And the other day I was astonished. I was speaking to a group of students in Hong Kong who fully well understand the provisions of the new national security law, and are still willing to speak to me. And that sort of thing fills one with inspiration. It's unfortunately, it's a difficult moment. So we, as David was saying, we look for these emblematic moments. A number of international human rights organizations took the British government to court on the sale of weaponry to Saudi Arabia, to the coalition, basically, in respect of Yemen. And at the level of the High Court, a decision was rendered, which basically was a positive one from a human rights perspective. And it's all those sort of small wins that can be gained, which will make up for the fact that the court cannot exercise jurisdiction when it simply doesn't have that jurisdictional coverage. And there has been some creative thinking about it, but it hasn't yielded the sort of results that we want. The more interesting case really is Libya, because Libya is a little bit like Syria. All these international actors involved, probably more difficult because you have oil involved as well. And then you have the migration flow from Libya to the north, and Europe's involvement in Libya. But then you have the same constellation of actors basically there, and you have the International Criminal Court. And so I think searching questions can be asked for here you have jurisdiction, and then why is it so painful when it comes to having the sort of results that one wants to see coming out of Libya. If we go just a little bit, I know we're focused on the Middle East, but in the context of the Arab world, at least, Sudan is interesting. Shaib now is in The Hague, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with Bashir and whether this unleashes some new energy into the willingness of a rather cynical Arab population to believe in the court and believe that the Arab public is entitled to justice. Aside from Tunisia and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you can well ask yourself as an Arab, as I'm sure Radwan would ask, why are we not entitled to justice in the way that other countries are entitled? And even in the context of Iraq and the tribunal that tried Saddam Hussein, very limited. And what we've seen now, the treatment of Daesh, it's well below international standards. And that's been chronicled time and again, and let alone the complications that exist there. And there are various anecdotes which I could share with you about Iraq. There's no doubting the suffering of the Iraqi people has been horrific, as has the Syrian people. Just appalling. And the victims deserve justice, and the perpetrators deserve to be punished, but they deserve fair trials as well. And where those standards are well below international standards, there is a searching questions that are required that need to be asked. But in general, one has to stay optimistic. I think in Rome, when we drafted the Rome Statute and the documents following Rome, we were too optimistic that the small group of people in various countries who were pushing for these new instruments would succeed internally in making the broader case. And there's so many interests that will shunt aside international criminal law, human rights considerations. And that's what we have to try and undo, and essentially elect and have better more enlightened leadership. But things can change very quickly. Let's see what happens on the 3rd of November in the United States, and then it can have a knock-on effect that can be far-reaching. And clearly, the US has to start at home as well. There are many things that the US needs to get right here, and then to do the right advocacy abroad, let alone then push this agenda further afield.
Thank you for that. So Bill, given the blockages that Zaid has discussed about accessing the International Criminal Court, so none of the states in question have ratified the treaty, and of course the Security Council is not going to refer any of these matters to the court because they have their own interests involved in those conflicts, and so effectively the ICC has been blocked. Your work has really been about assisting national prosecutions in Europe and elsewhere to prosecute crimes arising out of the intersecting wars in Syria and Iraq. So in the absence of action by the ICC, how effective have domestic courts been in dealing with the commission of international crimes by direct perpetrators and then also by those who would aid and abet the direct perpetrators?
Well, with respect to direct perpetrators, it has taken some time necessarily so, but the collected, if you will, national war crimes units of the West, and I would single out the Germans, the French, the Dutch, and indeed the United States for particular praise in this respect. It's taken them some time to get organized around the Syria problem, as you can imagine. It was a phenomenon, or it's a war where they can't engage directly, but it's also a very unique war where you've had groups such as Zeid, but not only Zeid, I hasten to add, that have pulled immense amounts of prima facie evidence out of the conflict zone and then made that available to those authorities. And then secondarily, because of the patterns of immigration, particularly, or frankly, refugee flows from the conflict zone into the West, most especially the Schengen zone of the European Union, there's great massive pool of suspects from which those authorities can draw. So we're starting to see some quite good action in terms of advanced investigations and prosecutions of Syrian regime and Daesh perpetrators who found their way to the West, or especially with some of the Daesh perpetrators or suspects, have found their way back to the West, found their way home. Now, does that translate into initiatives that encompass foreign actors, those fueling the fire, to use our prevailing metaphor today? Not yet. The complexity of targeting businessmen, and it's been touched on by a number of speakers now. There's the legal component, which we've addressed, but there's certain other investigative challenges, and one of the things that's come out of the Syria experience is domestic authorities have become quite comfortable working with private actors such as Zeid. So there's been a cultural change there. And then the nonprofit sector, because the private sector is all nonprofit in this respect, the nonprofit sector has become much more comfortable working with public sector law enforcement authorities. And then the cultures can be quite different. Zeid was set up specifically to help those people, but the other groups are especially international groups, are human rights groups. So they're not focused first and foremost on criminal investigations and prosecutions. So there's been this cultural sea change, which we're now starting to exploit with an eye to prosecuting or investigating and ultimately prosecuting economic actors, foreign economic actors. And ultimately, the success of these investigations will depend on public-private partnership. And the reason is that the private sector can work on the ground in Syria, collect information, prima facie evidence in different forms, whether it's witness testimony, documentation, of course, and so forth. Maybe even run sensitive sources within certain structures if they have the skill set to do that. With the private sector, so that's a very effective model if you're dealing with traditional suspects, your political actors, your military actors, your security intelligence officers. It is an imperfect model if you're dealing with economic actors, because what the private sector cannot do is get at bank records and in particular, and records of money transfers and all this sort of thing. This is where you need the muscle. The private sector, a group like CIGA, in principle, we could do that, but in practice, we don't, because many jurisdictions, first it would be illegal, and then there'd be admissibility problems. So ultimately, you need the private sector to handle that side. And so if we're going to hit any any foreign actors engaged in the Syria war, it's not going to encompass, for reasons that are already clear, any Russians or Hezbollah, Iranians, and so forth, working at state or quasi-state level. But we can get those unaffiliated or private businessmen in particular. But it will rest on that public-private partnership, and initiatives are, which I won't get into here for obvious reasons, are underway. Where we're going to see, I'm trying to keep it focused on Syria, but just as a final remark, 2 remarks, where I think we're going to have much more of a breakthrough here is in Libya. For reasons maybe at question time, if anyone's interested, I can get into, because the nature of the conflict there and perpetration is such that there's a number of, there's all manner of economic actors, business people who are exposing themselves to investigation and prosecution, and these won't be such difficult cases to make from a legal point of view, because we're talking about direct perpetration here in many cases, as opposed to aiding and abetting. But to wrap up, we need to hit foreign actors where we can, and to create disincentives for prolonging or expanding and prolonging these conflicts, not just in Syria. There is the potential to do that if we work in the realm of the possible. If we don't worry about Putin and whomever replaced Soleimani as in Iran and so forth. If we move incrementally within the current legal framework, and this is happening under the radar now, we will have some success here.
Great, thank you. So just for our audience, I'm going to ask one more question to our panelists. I see we've got some questions in the Q&A, which is terrific, so I'll turn to those next. But if you do have questions, please put them there, and we'll try and use the remainder of our time to answer your direct questions. So Radwan, final question to you. Because of your work and the work of other civil society actors, CIGA in this new sort of private investigative mode, and now the IIIM that was established by the General Assembly, Syria is now one of the best documented crime bases in human history. We have so much documentation about what happened, how people were affected, who was potentially involved, etc. I'm assuming you would answer this question that the international community has not done enough around accountability here. What more would you like to see the international community do?
Let me point it here to 3 key issues, and I think the answers of Zaid and Bill make my points much easier. Syria, it's within the context of the Middle East or the Arab world, where the justice system, it's considered to be of the weakest regional system comparing to any other region of the world, even comparing to the Asian standard, where China in the control of the ASEAN organization. But comparing to Europe or Latin America, still the justice system, of course, because most of the countries in the Middle East are French colonies, and we know actually the French colonies are way behind the British colonies regarding the rule of law. And we saw that in different countries, in South Africa, in other countries too. The second issue, it was a moment where that's a big hope for the civil society in the whole region, that the international justice system can do care about the region. to push for more change on the regional level. And it was the International Court of Lebanon, which started after the killing of Rafiq al-Hariri, because Lebanon was a case, and an important case, where the state funded 50% of the court. And when we have a case from the Security Council resolution under Charter 7 to establish the court to prosecute the killings of Rafiq al-Hariri, the former prime minister. And we just have actually the decision by the court last month. The cost of the court was almost $900 million. It's close to $1 billion. And then they indicted only one person of the killing of Rafiq al-Hariri, and 24 persons, and injuring 214 people. And then of course that makes anyone ask, if one person can actually kill a prime minister, and of course they indict him in an absentia, because the Lebanese government, they can't bring him into justice. Of course, that raises a lot of questions about the ability of the international court or the international system, including the International Criminal Court, in helping to establish a strong justice system in the region. And then of course it comes up with the court in the same case in Libya and in Iraq, as Zaid alluded to, of course, ISIS. ISIS, it was a crimes against humanity or undescribable crimes on the scenes. Everyone seeing the crimes of ISIS has been committed in front of the camera, and after now we can't see even any one case of prosecution within the regional system where most of the crimes committed. This is why I think that the faith in the international system within the region may be in the lowest. And that may make the belief now we have to focus more on the domestic, which linked to the political transition. I mean, after 2011, there was a hope for political transition. We have the case in Tunisia, and we have the case now in Sudan. That can put things back to the normal, where we have strong domestic justice system. But otherwise, I don't think that, of course, we have some big wins on the international level, even in the Syrian case, which what we call the international jurisdiction, in the case of Germany, the case of Spain and other countries, but those still very small wins, and they cannot make the case of the large amount of crimes and the crimes against humanity committed in Syria. And as you pointed, well documented, because it happened in the middle of the social media revolution, where we have constant document of the cases. Yesterday, a new evidence has been revealed in the Koblenz court in Germany, where one of the witnesses, who was just a normal person who just used to help burying bodies in Najha, in one of the court. And myself, even I've been documenting the war crimes in Syria in my organization, Damascus Center for Human Rights, since 2005. I never heard of one of the cases he mentioned, which large mass graves in one of the cities, Rabia. We know that most of the large atrocities or the mass graves are in Najha, but he mentioned one more. We never know. Even we don't have a satellite images of that mass grave. And this is tell you a case that even it's well documented, we still actually, we don't know the iceberg. We know maybe less than 2% of the cases has been committed with the Syria regime, because it's been too long, more than 10 years now, and with the zero cooperation by the Syrian government to take this issue as a serious, and it as it has should be by the international community, because involved now more in a peaceful settlement rather than focus on justice. I end by saying we have to be creative. Of course, the IIM, it's maybe a step, but putting actually the office of prosecutor without having the jurisdiction of a court, I'm not sure it can work, because it's just a replacement of the name of the COI, and another mechanism has been established in the Syrian case before. And we don't see actually a change or a shift exactly in our regard, in regard of the justice system in Syria, where actually the focus should be on the victims. We know now, right now, we have more than 100,000 of political prisoners inside the Syrian regimes now. And we got letters and messages every day of victims and families asking of the fate of their their beloved one. We don't have answers. We submitted hundreds of cases to the mechanism of the UN. We got actually normal access. Other way that the address is wrong, or we don't know any information about the case. And Professor David was involved in one of the cases of the Caesar case. All of us actually shocked to see actually the Nazi regime has been repeated 50 years after, regarding the documentations and number of the atrocities has been committed against a human being in photos and documented in photos. And yesterday we had a case. It's amazingly how it's the same emotional can be involved as we seen in Hollywood movies about the Holocaust in the 40s. I'm saying that we have a mixed feelings as a Syrian and as scholars, because we thought that the international justice build mechanism, it should be stronger after 2005, the International Criminal Court, the responsibility to protect, and we have at least 7 ad hoc international courts. We thought that we built a better justice, international justice system can prevent these cases from happening. Now we see it again 50 years after the Holocaust. It's a big setback. And of course, it pushes us again to think about what we should do again to prevent these cases and strengthen the justice system within the region. That's the most important thing. And I don't think the international system is the answer. We have to put our bid and hope in the political transition happening now in the region that can lead into a more serious thinking and more serious leadership in the region to think about the urgent of the justice system. And by far, unfortunately, we as Zaid mentioned, we are not lucky enough to have such a leadership, wise leadership, to think more about that. When we think about Mandela and actually the creation of the Supreme Court in South Africa in 1994, now in Tunisia 10 years, and they cannot actually come up with the conclusion of the Constitutional Court, which it's really key issue to dispute the conflict there in Tunisia. We need to invest more also in the political transition, in type of leaders they can come up later to put justice as a priority for them to build a wise and better society.
Great, thank you for that. So we've got some great questions. I'll start with this one, maybe to you, Bill, although if others want to weigh in, I think that would be great. And the question goes to that fact that many economic actors who will be aiding and abetting are going to be participating in the regular sort of mainstream economy. But with respect to terrorist groups or organized crime, et cetera, you may have a whole, almost a black market of financing here. And how can we identify individuals who are operating in this latter group in a meaningful way, considering how sort of shadowy they are, and that they may in fact be backed by state actors that have an interest in not having these be exposed? Bill, you're muted. Sorry.
no, my technical coronavirus is a disaster for me. It's just not improved my technical skills one bit. If anything, they've regressed. But I digress. That's an excellent question from Mr. Farhan. I saw. Farhan, everyone, from an investigative point of view, the shadowy operator, as you put it, presents some additional challenges, but not as many as you would think, because at the end of the day, it's very, very difficult to move, immense sums of money without banks. Of course, you can have cash and so forth, but the cash is bulky, surprisingly bulky, and in volume, even in $100 bills. You have to get your hands on it, and then in moving it, you can lose it, especially in war zones. Someone will take it from you. So at the end of the day, the if you will, legitimate businessmen or businessmen with the cover of legitimacy, and those who are operating in a more shadowy way, or indeed in other engaged in other sorts of criminal activities, narcotic trafficking and human trafficking and so forth. At the end of the day, they need banking services of some sort, almost invariably. And I don't want to get ahead of our panel chair, but I took the liberty of looking at your second question, and don't underestimate the muscle of the U.S. Treasury I wouldn't necessarily overstate its investigative capacity, although that's pretty considerable. But banks are terrified of the U.S. Treasury, in particular the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And any bank that, Beth can speak more about this than myself, but my understanding, any bank that wants to trade in U.S. dollars, and that's of course the currency of legitimate business, but also criminality, will think twice before running afoul of the U.S. Treasury, first, and secondly, if the American authorities, most especially, but also other authorities, come calling and want to know about certain transactions, those banks that want to continue to have access to U.S. dollars are going to cooperate with those inquiries. So yes, it is time-consuming, but I wouldn't suggest that either investigating the prima facie legitimate businessmen and their activities, or the shadowy guys, is from an investigative point of view all that different.
Great, thanks. So we also have a question in the chat about regional organizations. David mentioned it in his remarks, and there's a particular question about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a sort of subset of the Iranian armed forces operating throughout the Middle East region. Are there mechanisms to reach these regional bodies? And I guess I would just add to the question, I wonder what role the League of Arab States might be playing in this regard. Maybe I'll pitch that to you, Zaid, and then Radwan, if you've got remarks as well.
Yes, I do.
Okay, great. Maybe Zaid, and then, unless you want to go first, I'll let you two.
Okay. Well, I mean, look, in terms of Syria, I think the Arab League acquitted itself really well in 2011. What was very sad is that we couldn't get similar action in the UN General Assembly. We couldn't suspend Syria's membership from the General Assembly in the same way we did with South Africa many years ago, because immediately countries began to think, well, yes, maybe we should do it with regard to the Syrian regime, but then, our friends, our allies, they could also be the target of a similar action, and the whole thing fell flat. But I think the Arab League acquitted itself in the beginning really quite well. And in the first year, when you had the Shabiha committing crimes in Syria and the investigations went in, and the evidence we were getting at that stage was excellent. The problem is that the Arab League does have a human rights sort of architecture But as our dear and late friend Sharif Basyouni pointed out, without the individual right to petition, it sort of lacks the credibility which a human rights commission ought to have. And or even if you were thinking beyond that. And so we're not in that position. I mean, for me, it's painful because when I look back at the Rome conference and the negotiations before the Rome conference, and we in our meetings of the Arab group, I was member of the only delegation that wanted the court. All the Arab countries were not interested. And we're suffering from that because ever since we've seen accessions to the court statute at a very slow pace. And it's not helped by the fact, of course, major powers haven't joined it either. And so it's tragic what we're seeing happen. And Radwan's point on Rafiq al-Hariri and the cynicism Arabs feel, is very real. But I think, again, much can still change. If after the 3rd of November, there's a different leadership in the United States, and Beth, we see you back at state with in a very prominent position, maybe Secretary of State or something like that. Our hopes are going to be soaring that we are going to see changes afoot, and so one should never give up on that. But it is very tough going, and the struggle has to continue. I think one of the problems that in answer to the IIIM question, human rights investigators are not criminal investigators in the same way that Bill is or that David is. And so our reports that we were putting together, whether they be my own former office or international commissions, I didn't have the precision needed to ensure that the evidence would be admissible, and to make sure that that whether it's chain of physical custody or whatever the issue may be, had to be handled very, very carefully. So it made sense setting it up. And I thought right from the beginning, we'd set up a modular sort of IIIM. So you have now Syria and Myanmar, you attach Yemen, and then you have a permanent one. And then they break off into either ad hoc arrangements, or you have the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And I think that's still where we need to go, and hope that at a national level, we can focus on this. Just one issue, though, a chilling effect, because I think if any lawyer were to read, and this is different from the Alien Torts Act here in the US, but Article 38 of the National Security Law with reference to Hong Kong, the law is now moving into a different direction completely, where the Chinese basically are asserting their right to prosecute anyone, anywhere, irrespective of nationality or territorial jurisdiction, on account of crimes that are not international crimes. And so, if we're pushing the envelope, we have to be careful about how others also may use whatever they assume they can use. And we end up in very dangerous terrain here as well.
Thank you, Radwan.
Yes, with the case of Iran, International Revolutionary Guard, I think we have strong case in Syria. In 2013 and 14, especially before the Russian intervention in September 2015, it was the war. It was it's not going on regard of the Syrian regime, and it was clear that the Assad government, they have lack of resources, human sources. And the only way for them actually to rely on the missionaries from Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has only almost at that time 2,000 to 3,000 missionaries they can send to Syria. This is why when Qasem Soleimani stepped in and it come up with the idea of Fatimiyun and Zainabiyun, those two militias, Fatimiyun, and I feel sad because they use, and this is one of the issues I can mention later on, the sectarianism in the region. The sectarianism is the key issues, and actually it's one of the key issues can prevent any building a just system in the world. because they use very religious name within Islam. Fatimiyun and Zainabiyun related to Fatima and Zainab, which has very wholly attached, not only within the Shia sect of Islam, but also with the Sunni. Fatimiyun is a group actually where Iran, they can transport Afghani refugees from Iran and send them into Syria. And Zainabiyun, actually, Iran can transfer Pakistani Shia refugee from Pakistan and transfer into Syria. What interesting, because the New York Times actually, they work on different reports and they documented actually both groups, they've been well paid from almost 300 to 500. And of course, in this criminal, as Bill mentioned, we have to follow the money, the dirty money actually coming from. This is well documented cases that Iran, they open offices within the refugee camps within Iran, who they can actually, they have registration system and send them, and they give them almost every monthly salary, $300 to $500, which a dream for a refugee can live. And they send them into Syria, and they play a critical role, especially in Aleppo and in northern Syria in northern of Syria, tipping the war in the balance of the Assad government and providing the resources, the human resources much needed to the Syrian militias. The sad story of that, because of those missionaries, the Syrian opposition, in the case of Aleppo in March 2015, as example, in the Battle of Aleppo, they detained almost 151. It was 132 among them actually from Fatimiyun and Zainabiyun. And the Syrian regime at that time refused to do any swabbing. They don't care about them, missionaries, and this is why they've been killed. No, and we know in the missionaries in the international law, they have no rights. And even if they've been killed or massacred, nobody can care about them. But this is well-documented case about the use of aiding and abetting in the Syrian war, especially it can follow of the chain of the commands into the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and into the responsibility of Iran. And exactly, we build on the law of the International Court of Justice in the case I mentioned before, where Iran, they actually stepped the threshold, where actually direct involvement in the war, in the committing crimes. Because the Fatimiyun and Zainabiyun committed crimes on the scene, they have under exactly direct effect and leadership of the Revolutionary Guard at that time, with the help of enable them to commit the crimes. Of course, the same can apply into Hezbollah, but Hezbollah, as now we discover from the court of Lebanon, it's a very secretive organization. Such 10 years of investigation, we cannot come up with the system to know exactly what's happened there, unless there is a cooperation from the Lebanese government. They can actually provide us with the secrecy of the organization of Hezbollah. We cannot prove actually the decision-making process in Hezbollah to be involved in the Syrian war.
Great, thank you so much. I think we've answered, there's a couple of questions that I didn't raise, but I think they've been answered in the various responses, and I know we're running low on time. So I thought I would turn it over to David to give us some closing remarks, and then back to the Jackson Center to close our event out.
Well, thank you, Beth, and thank you all for listening in on this very, very important conversation, an issue of the murky, shadowy world behind these dirty little conflicts that we see in 2020 that have been the scourge of the 21st century and hopefully won't be seen throughout the century. But again, I think we need to continue to just be aware that when we have conflict, there are many layers behind that conflict of actors and players that are profiting and are benefiting for whatever nefarious reason they are part of this. And I think that that's very important for all of us to be aware of it. For those of us that are in the practice of this, we need to continue to be innovative, investigatory wise, but also in prosecutions and in seeking regional and international efforts to rein in a trend which is really still not reined in at all. So again, to my colleagues, Beth, to you for your important questions, I thank you, and I will turn it back over to Kristen for final comments, and have a good day.
Thank you, David. And thank you for joining us today. Our 2020 program theme is The Other Through Your Eyes. And so we're always excited to be able to bring this caliber of programming to our audience, and especially on such a critical issue as this. If you are interested in seeing more programs from the Jackson Center, please sign up on our website, roberthjackson.org, and follow us on social media. On Facebook and on Twitter, we are RHJ Center. Beth, Zaid, Bill, Radwan, and David, thank you so much for sharing your voices today and your thoughts. We cannot say thank you enough. And thank you also to our audience for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.